These are days and nights of venom and blood. Heroes will rise as the anchors fall.
What is up, YouTube? Dottz Gaming here, and today I am bringing you guys a werewolf and vampire guide. It's going to be a complete overview to both werewolves and vampires. Now, this video has been requested several times, so I finally got around to actually making it. Becoming a werewolf or a vampire can give your character some pretty sweet passive bonuses, as well as give your character some awesome aesthetic features if you're into them. Of course, though, to keep things balanced, these bonuses do come with their drawbacks. I'm not only going to cover all of the bonuses and drawbacks in this video today, but also talk about how you actually can become a vampire or a werewolf, and the reasons why you would want to become one. This guide is broken down into two sections, obviously, one for the werewolf and one for the vampire. Timestamps will be displayed on the screen right now, but unless you already know which you want to be and which is best for your character, if any are at all, I would recommend watching both sections to understand whether or not a vampire, a werewolf, or neither is right for your character. The first section we are going to start with is the werewolf. The werewolf brings to the table its own set of positive and negative effects, but in terms of positives, you get access to some awesome abilities and passives, especially for stamina users. The first one I'm going to talk about is the ultimate for the skill line, Werewolf Transformation, the thing that you want to transform into. You transform into a beast, fearing 3 nearby enemies for up to 4 seconds, and while transformed, your light attacks cause enemies to bleed over 8 seconds, and your physical and spell resistance are increased. While slotted, you also gain stamina recovery, 15%. As you can see, this is extremely good for stamina users. This can be morphed into either Pack Leader or Werewolf Berserker. Pack Leader gives you 2 wolf companions by your side. Werewolf Berserker increases the damage of the bleed from your light attacks. The next active ability you can get is Pounce. You pounce at an enemy with Primal Fury to deal physical damage and stun them if they are already off balance. Changing into Brutal Pounce will deal damage to all enemies in an area of effect, while Feral Pounce will increase the time in werewolf form every time you use the ability, so your werewolf form's duration will be increased every time you use Feral Pounce. The next ability is Hircine's Bounty. Invoke the Huntsman's Blessing to heal yourself for a flat amount. Now, if you change it into Hircine's Rage, if you morph it, you get increased weapon damage, but if you get Hircine's Fortitude, you also get a hot heal over time effect. The next ability is Roar. You roar with Bloodlust, fearing up to 3 nearby enemies, afflicting them with fear, and setting them off balance for 4.3 seconds. So as you can see, if you want to really go a big werewolf build, that would combine very well with Pounce. The morphs are Ferocious Roar, so killing a feared target leaves nearby enemies off balance and disoriented, and Rousing Roar, which increases the weapon damage of allies around you. The next is Piercing Howl. Crush an enemy with a deafening howl, dealing physical damage and knocking them down for 3 seconds. Morphing that into Howl of Despair gives you Feeding Frenzy synergy, which will increase your allies' basic attacks, and Howl of Agony deals increased damage to nearby enemies that are currently feared. The next is Infectious Claws. Mauls enemies in front of you with Tainted Claws, dealing X physical damage and X disease damage over 10 seconds. Morphing that into Claws of Anguish will make your targets receive less healing, and Claws of Life will give you a heal over time based on damage done. Now let's move into the passives. So the first passive is Pursuit. While in werewolf form, your heavy attack stamina return is increased by up to 100%. Devour, which allows you to devour a corpse in order to increase the duration of your werewolf transformation by 12 seconds. Blood Rage, which increases the time in werewolf form by 3 seconds every time you take damage, and this can only occur every 3 seconds. Blood Moon, which allows the player to turn another player into a werewolf once every 7 days, by returning to the werewolf ritual site. This is very important. Keep this passive in mind for later when I talk about how to actually become a werewolf. The next is Savage Strength, which increases weapon damage by 9%, and then 18% at rank 2. And then Call of the Pack, which reduces the cost of remaining in werewolf form by 20% for each transformed werewolf in your group, including yourself, up to a maximum of 80%. In terms of the negatives that come along with being a werewolf, you become extremely vulnerable to Fighter's Guild abilities due to their passives, namely the ultimate Dawnbreaker. Dawnbreaker is going to hit you like a bus in PvP, specifically if that player also has points in the Fighter's Guild passive skill tracker, which increases the damage of your Fighter's Guild abilities by 20% against undead, aka vampires, Daedra, and werewolves. From my research, I've been able to conclude that that's what makes Dawnbreaker hits werewolves and vampires as hard as it does. So players that have skill tracker and are using the Dawnbreaker ultimate, if you are a werewolf, will be hitting you very, very hard. So you're probably wondering though, should I make my character a werewolf even though we know all these passive and negative benefits now? Well, these positive benefits and negative effects. Anyone who wants to play a stamina-based DPS build can absolutely benefit from becoming a werewolf. You do need to decide for yourself, though, if becoming a werewolf will ultimately benefit your build. Most stamina DPS will benefit from it, but Magicka users really won't. For PvPing, you need to be prepared to take some extra damage from Dawnbreaker and other Fighters Guild abilities, so keep that in mind when making a PvP build. In terms of should I become a werewolf as a stamina-based tank, I would say it's 100% dependent on your build. It could sometimes be a hindrance or just totally ineffective to your gameplay, like it won't really add anything, if your build does not take lycanthropy into consideration. Now, when it comes to actually becoming a werewolf, you have one of three options. You could buy lycanthropy off of the Crown Store, be bitten by an NPC, or be bitten by a player. The easiest of these options, though, is obviously to just buy it off the Crown Store for 1,500 crowns, which equates to $15 US. The second option, though, which is free, and the one I'd recommend, is to be bitten by a player. Players who are werewolves that have the Blood Moon passive trait can turn other players into werewolves. In order to actually contract lycanthropy from that player, though, you need to find a werewolf player with that trait I just mentioned, and go to a werewolf shrine. Now, this is when the Destinations add-on comes very much in handy so that you can see on your map where the vampire altars are if you want to become a vampire, and where the werewolf shrines are if you would like to become a werewolf. Or if you're not on PC, though, a quick Google search can help you find one of these locations. So you need to go to this werewolf shrine and have the player bite you, thus giving you lycanthropy, and giving you the quest to start unlocking the werewolf skill line. The third way is to be bitten by a werewolf NPC, noted by my destinations. You could only contract lycanthropy, though, from specific werewolves. It's not like if you find a random werewolf in game, you can just kind of contract lycanthropy from it. It's specific werewolves that spawn in specific spots. But the reason I recommend this method the least is because there are players who like to grief these locations and just kill the mobs as they spawn. Also, the respawn rate for these is not high, and I believe that they also share spawn locations with the Blood Fiends for the vampires. That is the NPC that gives the vampire disease. I forget the name off the top of my head at this point in my script, but unless you're lucky, you're not really going to find the NPC that gives you the disease, so I would just recommend getting a player to do it. It's really not that hard. There are plenty of players that give it away for free. But if you're antisocial and don't want to talk to anyone, you could always just buy it off the Crown Store. Alright, now the next section we're going to move into is the vampire section, my personal favorite being that I play a vampire. Now the vampire, just like the werewolf, brings its own set of positive and negative effects to the table. Unlike the werewolf, though, the vampire has passive negatives and positives outside of your skill tree that it gives the player depending on what stage of vampirism you're in. Sanguinary Vampirist, bingo, there's the name of the disease, which is the disease that gives you the vampire skill line, has 4 stages. Each stage lasts 6 hours, and casting vampire abilities advances the time by 30 minutes. Feeding as a vampire, sucking an NPC's blood, stereotypical vampire thing, will reduce the stage of that vampirism by 1. The passives, aka the passives outside of your skill tree, like these just kind of like passive, positive and negative things, that the vampire brings are: you take extra flame damage, your vampire abilities cost less, and there's a health recovery reduction, and this scales up as your vampirism stages up. So when you hit vampirism stage 4, which by the time you see the skill points, like the skill lines and the passives through the skill tree, you're going to want to stay at vampirism stage 4. You end up taking 25% additional flame damage, 21% additional cost on your vampire abilities, or 21% vampire ability cost reduction, it's the opposite, and 75% health recovery reduction. So obviously, if you're playing a vampire, having a character that's going to be able to reduce the amount of magic damage you take is going to be very helpful in mitigating this flame damage, the extra damage that you take from flame. But in terms of positives that you gain from the skill line, which is arguably, because I know so far vampirism doesn't look very good with just these side effects, but it brings a lot of awesome passives and skills to the table, especially for Magicka users. The first ability that the vampire brings is Bat Swarm. It is the ultimate. Darken the sky with a cloud of bats, dealing magic damage to nearby enemies every second. When you morph it into Clouding Swarm, you also get invisibility, and when you morph it into Devouring Swarm, you gain health for every enemy that is hit. The first regular active ability is Drain Essence, which just consumes your enemy's life force, dealing magic damage and restoring 20% of your missing health every second for 3 seconds. And when you activate the Drain, the enemy is stunned for 3 seconds. When you change that to Invigorating Drain, you recover 5 ultimate every second, and Accelerating Drain gives you Minor Expedition, increasing your movement speed by 10 seconds for 17 to 20 seconds. The next ability is Mist Form, which lets you dissolve into a dark mist, reducing damage that you take by 75% for 4 seconds, removes and grants you invulnerability to all crowd control and immobilization effects while it's active, but you cannot be healed, and your Magicka recovery is completely disabled. If you morph that into Elusive Mist, you get Major Expedition, increasing your movement speed, and Baleful Mist will cause the Mist Form to deal damage to any enemies standing near you. In terms of passives, you get Savage Feeding, where after feeding on your target, they become off balance and stunned for 2 seconds. Really not that great. I don't really talent into it. You're never going to really find much of a use for it, in my opinion. Supernatural Recovery, which increases your Magicka and Stamina recovery by 10%. Blood Ritual, keep an eye on this because you can help players become a vampire with this ability, very similar to Blood Moon from the Werewolf. Allows you to turn another player into a vampire once every 7 days by returning to a vampire ritual site. You have Undeath, which reduces the damage dealt to you when you fall below 50% health, and lower health increases this effect by up to 33%. So the lower your health becomes, the less damage you take, up to an 83% damage reduction. Unnatural Resistance reduces the severity of health recovery detriment in Vampirism stages 2 through 4, so that health recovery penalty that you suffer for being a vampire gets severely mitigated, which is awesome. It removes some of those side effects. And then you have Dark Stalker, which decreases the movement speed penalty while in crouch by 50%, and then makes you crouch quicker while it is nighttime. Besides the side effects that being a vampire brings, the other main negative that is brought to the table is the same as the werewolf. You become very vulnerable to some fighters' guild abilities due to the passives that the tree brings, and namely the ultimate Dawnbreaker. Dawnbreaker is gonna hit you like a truck in PvP, especially if the player has points in the Fighters Guild passive Skilled Tracker, which will increase the damage that it deals by 20% against you. At least from my research, this is what I've been able to conclude that makes Dawnbreaker hit werewolves and vampires as hard as it does. Now you're probably wondering now, with all of this stuff, should I make my character a vampire? Anyone who wants to play a Magicka-based DPS class could definitely benefit becoming a vampire. The passives that it brings through the skill tree greatly outweigh, at least in my opinion, the side effects that come along with it. But you ultimately need to decide for yourself if becoming a vampire is going to benefit your build. In my opinion, I do think most stamina DPS will absolutely benefit from it, while stamina users, really not so much. Stamina users can benefit from it, but the benefits are very limited and extremely build specific, and I personally don't recommend it unless you have a lot of experience in this game. You know, with werewolves can really are kind of, you're playing stamina as a werewolf, you're really not playing Magicka. But with vampires, a case can be made for stamina users, but I personally don't think it's worth playing a vampire as a stamina user, but that is just my humble opinion. Again, if you have a specific build or are knowledgeable in the game to try to make it work, then go ahead. But just as a general rule of thumb, I say werewolf for stamina, vampire for Magicka. For PvPing, you need to be prepared to take some extra damage from Dawnbreaker, others Fighters Guild abilities, and flame damage from players, as generally Inferno staves for destruction are the most common. So keep that in mind when you're making a PvP build. In terms of should I become a vampire as a Magicka-based tank or healer, I would say it's 100% dependent on your specific build. It can sometimes be a hindrance or completely ineffective, like a completely useless addition to your gameplay, if your build does not take vampirism into consideration. Now, when it comes to actually becoming a vampire, you have one of 3 options, and they are the same 3 options that you have to become a werewolf. You could just buy vampirism straight up off the crown store, be bitten by an NPC, or be bitten by a player. The easiest option, the one that obviously takes the least amount of effort, is to just buy it off the crown store for 1,500 crowns, which equates to roughly about 15 US dollars. The second option, and the one I recommend, is to be bitten by a player. Players who are vampires that have the passive blood ritual trait can turn other players into vampires. In order to contract sanguinary vampiris from a player, you need to find a vampire player with the trait I just mentioned and go to a vampire shrine. So I'm going to show you an example from Bankorai. There is a vampire shrine right here. Vampire altar, excuse me. Again, here, the destinations add-on or a quick Google search can help you find these locations. When a player actually brings you to the altar and bites you, you will contract the disease, and you will get the starting quest to unlock the vampire skill line. The third way is to be bitten by a blood fiend NPC, but the ones that you actually can contract sanguinary vampiris from are in specific locations, and I believe they share spawn locations with the werewolves that allow you to contract lycanthropy. Again, the add-on destinations or a quick Google search can help you find these locations. But the reason I personally do not recommend this method is because some players like to grief these locations and just basically like one-shot the mobs to make sure no one else can get them. I don't know, I guess they're really that bored. But to my knowledge, the respawn rate isn't really that high, and like I said, it shares spawn location with the werewolf NPCs. So unless you're lucky, you're gonna spend a long time looking for an NPC to give you the disease. Keep in mind though, guys, becoming a werewolf or a vampire absolutely isn't necessary to build your character for success, but it can give your build that little bit of extra oomph that it needs if you want to have some extra passives in your build, or if you're like me and also just like the aesthetics of the vampire or the lore behind them, or same thing with the werewolf, just become one of them. You know, that's basically the main reason I became a vampire. I love Elder Scrolls Vampires. I love the lore behind them, and the fact that it brought magic bonuses to the table to help augment my character's abilities was just a huge bonus. But again, you need to decide for your build and for yourself as a player if becoming a werewolf or a vampire is the right decision for you. But that's about it for me today, guys. If you have any questions regarding vampires or werewolves, or whether or not you should become one, or any of the passives that they bring, please leave a comment below, and I will be happy to help. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please hit that like button. It really helps me out. And of course, please subscribe. And if you guys wouldn't mind, I would appreciate if you maybe spread the word about my channel to some people who you know might need some help getting started into ESO, as I really am trying to grow my channel. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'm Dottz Gaming, and I will see you next time.